Okay, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Dr. Fatma Ismail, Director for Outreach and Programs at RC. I'm so pleased to have with us today Dr. Peter Brand. Dr. Brand is a professor of ancient history in the Department of History at Memphis University. Since 2001, Dr. Brand has served as the director of the Karnak Great Hypostyle Hall project, sponsored by the University of Memphis, which aims to record and publish all the monumental inscriptions and reliefs from this huge building. Dr. Brand is now researching his fifth book, which will investigate how Egyptian pharaohs used gold to enhance their authority, influence, and prestige. Dr. Brand's area of focus in Egyptology is the history and culture of the New Kingdom, especially in the late 18th dynasty and the Ramesside period. In his research and teaching, he uses a multidisciplinary approach that integrates history, art history, language, and epigraphy. His lecture today is titled All the King's Wives, Ramesses II's Royal Women. This lecture examines the phenomenon of New Kingdom royal polygamy in the case of Ramesses II's wives. At least 11 women can be identified as wives of this king, including 5 of his own daughters and 2 Hittite princesses. Eventually, he sired at least 48 sons and 53 daughters. By reconstructing Ramesses' family and comparing it to the patterns of royal polygamy in other historic cultures, we can gain insights into the political and social dynamics of Ramesses II's huge family and its ideological role in this conception of kingship. I'm sure we're all very excited to learn more about all of this. Please welcome Dr. Peter Brand.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm very grateful to RC to invite me to give this monthly presentation of their lecture series. I've just recently published a book on Ramesses II, and one of the themes was the ideology of Ramses' kingship and how this was expressed various ways. And even in the case of his royal family, the way he represented them in monuments and even the very size of this large family are expressions of ideology. And we can also see that he had a large number of wives. And the question arises is, why did he have so many wives? Why did he have so many children? Which again, in part has to do with ideology. So a lot of the information from this lecture, if you want to read about it in more detail, can be found in my recent book on Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh, mainly in chapter 7, but there are also a few parts elsewhere in the book that talk about his early family career and his diplomatic marriages with the Hittites. Now, one of the things I think we have to deal with right up front as an issue when we are thinking about polygamy and the marriage of multiple women in various modern and ancient cultures, everything from Ottoman Turkey, back to antiquity, is the question of the so-called harem, but also the question of how until recently, historians and experts tended to view the question of royal polygamy in itself. And there's a form of European thought that is unfortunately now dying out called Orientalism. And in this case, various kind of Near Eastern or Middle Eastern or even Indian rulers were considered to be what are called Oriental despots, and that they housed their large numbers of wives because many of these cultures have been polygynous or polygamy. That they must have housed all their, or even confined their royal women and children into a so-called royal harem or harem. And it wasn't until the later 20th century that this started to die out, fortunately. Now, when you actually look at other studies from other cultures, even from Ottoman Turkish studies, the traditional sort of Orientalist views of the harem as basically sort of almost like a pleasure palace, but also a prison for all the rulers' many women, wives, and so-called concubines, and that this was a sort of ultimate sexual playground for him, but it was also a kind of gilded cage or prison for the women who were supposedly locked up inside. And many reconstructions of ancient harems, including, or what are called ancient harems, including in pharaonic Egypt, are directly compared to the Ottoman model. And this is actually quite misguided, even if the Orientalist, sort of prejudice is removed. So even if there was a household compound for various women and children of the king to reside, it doesn't mean that they were confined there or that it was identical to something like the imperial harem of the Ottoman sultans. Now, so we have to take on the question of the harem, because until recently, and even today still, many Egyptologists refer to this institution of the domestic quarters of the royal family as a harem. And you can see here a quote on the bottom where one Egyptologist from the UK, Jan Picton, you can read her statement almost in frustration that the women that were in the king's household, and she was also talking about the foreign princesses that the pharaohs often made, that she said if they could have picked any word, even if it was an artificial word or some other kind of word to describe the system of royal polygamy and the family quarters of the king's wives and children, that if it had been anything but a harem, it would have been better. And here, of course, you see a representation from Medinet Habu, where you see these various young women that are interacting with Pharaoh. And this, of course, played on the imaginations of Orientalist-oriented early Egyptologists. But as we understand it now, it is quite different. So there are two Egyptian terms that have often been translated as, quote, harem, sometimes both at the same time. One is ipetnesu, and the other one is the perchener. The ipetnesu means something like the royal apartments or the royal privy chambers, if you will, the private quarters of the king. And it's actually similar to the temple of Luxor, which is called the Ipet Resi, the southern sanctuary of Amun, where it had also its series of rooms that were hidden at the back of the temple. Now, there's another institution which has often been identified as a harem, and is what's called the perchener, the so-called household. And the question is, what does chener mean? One of the traditional explanations that it means something like the confined household, i.e. a harem that was a cloister for royal women and children. We now know, and there's been several excellent works, including a recent Czech dissertation on the question of chener, and we understand that the term chener refers to a class of female musicians and dancers. In temples, they played and they participated in musical liturgy for the gods, but there was also a perchener in the royal palace. And the way that this perchener and the royal apartments of the king operated, we can see the most elaborate titles for this institution that had to do with apparently a kind of mobile or perambulating royal household that traveled about the country with the king as he made progresses throughout his kingdoms. And in the Turin juridical papyrus that describes the assassination of Ramesses III, it's described as the epetnesu, the royal apartments of the household of the chener performances, in the following, in the sense of in the following, meaning that they travel about and they follow the king wherever he goes. And in fact, this would have been a relatively small number of family members. If you look at one of these small palaces like that, the temple in Medinet Habu, where the king visited sometimes. They were only big enough to house relatively small numbers of courtiers and royal relatives alongside the king himself. There were other larger palaces, of course, in places like Memphis, and even a kind of residential palace in the Fayum that's often also called the so-called harem palace that actually had extensive quarters for housing members of the king's own family. Now, if we think about the overall organization of the royal household, essentially the royal estate writ large, and within that the palace, which is called an there are these two institutions that are often related to one another, the Perchener and the Ipetnesu, and these royal apartments are said to be of or belonging to the Perchener. And so one way that you can conceive it through this diagram is that within the whole royal estate includes the entire administrative apparatus and economic system of the king's larger estate, including multiple palaces throughout the kingdom. But then in a typical palace in an that there was this Perchener, and within it, or sometimes described as being belonging to it, is the Ipetnesu. So I think we can see the sort of the Perchener as sort of the outer part of an aspect of the royal household, and then sort of part of that or within that is the royal apartments. Now, one of these things that we can see in terms of what the Perchener actually functioned and the people within it are some scenes from the late 18th dynasty that represent the interiors of palaces that emphasize the women that are there actually performing music and dance in various ways. So here you have from the tomb of the high official I at El Amarna, you see in on the right a palace with several rooms, and in it are women that are doing things like dancing, but also playing different types of musical instruments. And I think that these women and the institution that they were part of was actually the Perchener. And this had a ceremonial role and also religious role to play within the royal household and the palace, much like there were Percheners, the estates of the Chener performers that were attached to various temples, including the temples of Amun at Thebes. Now, another way we can sort of get an idea of the extended areas of the royal palace, including gardens, etc., but probably also the formal audience halls and that kind of thing, is a scene actually from the tomb of the official Neferhotep that shows the wife of King I rewarding a noblewoman as various women and some male attendants surround these women. Some of them are also playing musical instruments during this reward ceremony. And we also know of an institution within the royal administration in the New Kingdom, what was called the Ipetnesu of the Hemetnesu, so the royal apartments of the king's wife, because certainly the king's wife, the queen, would not have her own harem. So this is yet another nail in the coffin, that this idea of the Perchenerate is actually some kind of harem. So this is another thing we have to keep in mind, and this is one of the things that's come out through recent research on these institutions and the role that women played within them. And I speculated in my Ramesses book that perhaps the queen had her own kind of Perchener household, and that there was also, in particular, a kind of a women's elite circle among the courtiers, where the queen presided over this society or courtly following of elite women, who, of course, would often be minor members of the royal family, female members in particular, but also the women of various courtiers and elite officials that came to the palace when the king was there or the queen was in attendance. Now, in terms of Ramesses II himself and his career, rather spectacular career, as a family man with so many wives and over 100 children. The earliest evidence for the beginning of his career as a family man actually dates to an inscription that describes his career as a crown prince under his father Sety I before Seti's death. And in a long inscription at Seti's temple at Abydos called the Abydos Dedicatory Inscription, there are parts of it where he describes his sort of upbringing and training to be a pharaoh to be under the tutelage of Sety I. And as Ramesses grew into adolescence, probably even early adolescence, and given the fact that he was the elder son and heir of Sety when the dynasty was brand new and perhaps hanging by a genetic thread, that it was urgent that Sety took provisions to make sure that his son married multiple women, again in keeping with the ideal of royal polygamy. In order to, in part, to guarantee the succession, but as we'll see, also to elevate his status as the eventual pharaoh himself. And although it's somewhat damaged, there's a rather interesting passage from this description where the king says, Ramesses says this after his father's death. He said that he, Sety, furnished me with a female household, a periot. You see here the upper box that has the word written out, perit, and it has an image of a woman hieroglyph as well as plural strokes. So this is, if you will, a female household. And that he also received ipitnesu, royal apartments, that were comparable to the beautiful maidens, what are called the Nefrut of the palace. And these were young women, including perhaps some that would have married the king. And he mentions that Sety actually selected wives for him, apparently at least several wives. We don't know how many, but it was more than one or two. And that this was throughout some place or region, I suspect, across throughout the land or across Egypt. And that, again, the inscription breaks down. There's a reference to Heneriu women, which are basically, or women of the Perhener, that also has this determinative of a seated woman. And then it gets even more broken down, but it's quickly apparent that Ramesses and his new brides quickly got to work producing royal children. And then there's a reference to the household of the Hener, or Heneru, the musical performance, and also to a group of women that are called the Henem set, which means something like female companions. Although what this means exactly is not clear. But the bottom line is that he received this household establishment, and that was called an ipitnesu, and that he immediately began to produce multiple children by them, even in his adolescence before the death of Sety. Now, there are a number of different titles that belong to various categories of royal women, and all of them are based on their relationship to the king. So we have the king's wife, the Hemetnesu, of which there can be multiple Hemetnesus at the same time. But there's also the Hemetnesu Weret, the great royal wife. And this is often seen as a unique, premier royal wife who is above all others, and that there's only one of them at a time. But in fact, we can see it in different periods, including the reign of Amenhotep III, and also in Ramesses II's reign, that there were times when there could be multiple great royal wives. But it also reflects an important aspect of the royal family, that there was a pecking order, there was a hierarchy, and that people were of different statuses. The female, partners and wives of the king. And here would also just bury the idea that there ever was such a thing as a concubine. There was no such thing as a concubine. Almost all these women surely would have been referred to as royal wives, Hemetnesu, with a number of elite royal wives standing out as great royal wives. But this again reflects the hierarchy and is actually similar to other polygamous systems, especially one thinks of the various titles for higher and lower ranking wives of the Chinese emperor during the imperial period. Another very important type of royal woman was actually the dowager of the new king's father, the Mutnesu, the mother of the king. And then, of course, we have royal daughters that are known as the Senate Nesu. And we also have a category of women, but not just women, sometimes men, but mostly represented as women, who are known as the king's children, the Mesut Nesu. And these are often not simply the current children of the reigning pharaoh, but sometimes female relatives that were presumably, sisters or cousins or or second cousins of the pharaoh that were related to the previous pharaoh or descended from other branches of the royal family. And we can see images of these, for instance, in some of the Akhenaten temple scenes where it's clear that they are not small children, they are actually adult women. And then there's also a category that is simply called the beautiful ones of the palace, the Nefrut. And here I think this probably refers to young women, perhaps prepubescent women, or just women before they married and had children. In other words, sort of virgins. And so perhaps we can call them the beautiful maidens that are said to be of the palace. Now, perhaps the most important or equally important royal wife in the reign of Ramses II was not actually his actual great royal wife, Nefertari, but actually his mother, the king's mother, and also known by various titles, including king's great royal wife and the god's wife and the god's mother, that relate to the fact that she was the husband of the previous king, Sety I, but it was also now the mother of the new kingdom. And in terms of their ideological significance, but even perhaps their political influence, it can't be understated just how important a role the Queen Mother played in the king's reign. And again, we can see this by comparison with other cultures, where the dowager not only can sometimes act as regent for a child king, but throughout the king's reign, that the royal mother, as long as she is alive, is a close confidant and an important ideological, especially in Egypt, ideological underpinning of his royal legitimacy. But to hint at the potential in some cultures for the power of these women is the fact that one of the Mughal emperors of India left his mother in charge of his kingdom when he went to war in what is now Afghanistan for a period of 2 years. And when you think about it, a royal wife whose son becomes a king, even if she's a great royal wife, she will lose a fair amount of her status and her prestige once that her husband dies, unless she is also the mother of the new king. And of course, she knows that her entire influence and prominence depends on the fact that she is the mother of the new king. And that means she's absolutely reliable, and that the king himself, if he can't trust mom, who else can he trust? And in fact, there were great bonds of trust, as we see again in various polygamous cultures around the world. And the queen mother, the dowager, often had a kind of political influence, if not outright political power. Now, the ideological and religious role, of course, of the Queen Mother, in this case, Queen Tuya, is the fact that, according to the official ideology or mythology, is the god Amun himself impregnated the wife of the new king's the wife of the former king's. Let me restate that the divine birth of the king, of the new king, he played the mythology that somehow his mother, the wife of the previous king, had actually had an affair, quite literally and was impregnated by the god Amun himself. And this is represented rather tastefully in this scene here that comes from Luxor Temple, but also is shown at Deir el-Bahri. And the continuing influence of the Queen Mother we can see extending often throughout the king's reign, sometimes even after her own death, because you see this relief in limestone on the left actually dates to late in Ramses' reign, at least a couple of decades after her own death. She continued to play a significant ideological role, even if he could no longer consult or seek her advice. Now, of course, we are mainly going to be looking at the wives of Ramses, the multiple wives of Ramses. And one of the common features, again, that you see around the world is that polygamous kings tended to have large numbers of children. And even today, there are some of the ceremonial kings in places in West Africa, for instance, where some of these kings are known to have, dozens or even as many as 70 or more children. And of course, we see that also in various other ancient and modern sources as well. And of course, the king can produce many children, as Ramses II did. And that he represented them on the monuments in these sort of great parades of sons and daughters. But again, the question is, why did he have so many children? Well, you might think that it has to do with guaranteeing that one of them will survive the king and that the line won't die out. But I don't think it was necessary for Ramses to have 48 sons just to make sure that at least one of them would survive him. In fact, overproducing royal children was, especially royal sons, was actually a kind of downside if those sons should squabble amongst themselves over who will become king, or even decide to kill off dear old dad to make sure that they are the one that becomes king, as happened in the assassination of Ramses III. And it's more likely that it has to do with prestige, in the case of an Egyptian pharaoh, as a representation of his fertility, which ensures the fertility of Egypt itself, both its people, but also its agricultural lands and domesticated animals. If the king is a bounteous source of fertility, he will lend that quality to all of Egypt. Now, the question is to produce so many children, as I say, roughly, and I try to make the count, and some of the sources are rather broken or obscure, but the last count I had was at least 48 sons and 53 daughters. The question is, how many wives did he have in order to produce so many children? Well, we know he had 11 wives, but actually most of them were married late in the reign. Whereas at the beginning of his reign, even under Sety I as crown prince, we know he had multiple wives. We don't know exactly how many, but we know there were multiple ones. And when we consider the two most elite queens from the earliest part of the reign, the famous Nefertari and her less well-known colleague, Queen Isetnofret, together they apparently produced about 14 children. It may be that they had a few other children that we can't identify, but surely these two women did not have 50 or more children each. So there had to be other women. And since most of these children were born in the early part of the reign, it seems likely that there were other women, at least several, perhaps even a dozen or more, that were also having children at the same time during Ramses' career as crown prince, and perhaps into roughly the first 2 decades of his reign. And so these women, however, remain completely anonymous. We don't have any idea who they were or even where they were buried. But they must have been responsible for the births of at least 80 children or more children in order to make up the huge number of children that Ramses had. Even if some children were born later in his reign, even within the first 2 decades, there must have been a few dozen royal children that were born during this period, before Ramses married his own daughters, or before he married foreign princesses from the Hittite kingdom. Now, an example of the ultimate fate of minor royal women or royal wives is a tomb that was recently excavated in the Valley of the Kings by a Swiss mission. And this was KV 40. And in it, they found the remains of the burials of at least 50 individuals, probably more, in a fragmentary state, but from pottery jars that were inscribed sometimes with one little ivory, sort of wooden tag, and with identifying the gender and rough age of these human remains, we know that there were over 50 individuals, and many of them were women. And inscriptions tell us that at least 2 of them are wives, Amenhirkhopeshef, and that several have foreign wives, suggesting that they foreign names that suggesting they may have been part of diplomatic marriages or imperial oversight of Egypt's domains that would send women to Pharaoh to be part of his court and part of his household. And of course, these women, often the only way we know their name is if it's inscribed on one of their pieces of funerary equipment. But of course, the king never dedicated monuments to any of them. And so unless we have that kind of personal information, we look to the monuments and the official inscriptions, and we have no idea who all these wives are in the case of Ramses. Because, and this is quite linked, because the most important wife during her lifetime, until shortly after the Hittite peace treaty in the year 21, was the great royal wife, also known as the greatly favored one, Queen Nefertari, the famous queen of Ramesses II. She held a string of titles, but she outshone or eclipsed all the other royal wives of Ramesses II during her lifetime. She had the marquis position, and other royal women, even a later queen, another queen that's quite well known later on, Isetnofret, who was the mother of some of Ramses' younger sons, first sons, I should say, that Nefertari even outshone the second most important royal wife in the palace establishment. And solely it's Nefertari and her eldest son, Prince Amenhirkhopeshef, as we'll see, that appear on these monuments. Nefertari enjoyed a number of special epithets and official titles that were more than we see for any of the other royal women, which is again a reflection of her supreme importance and prestige and place in the hierarchy of the royal family. Again, some of them are known for various royal wives, like God's wife, or the great wife, or the hereditary nobleman, or mistress of the 2 lands, mother of the gods, mother of the king. But Nefertari also has these very evocative but ceremonial epithets, like wife of the victorious bull, the lady of charm who's sweet of love, beautiful in the tall plumed diadem, and my favorite one inscribed on the facade of her temple at Abu Simbel is, she for whom the sun itself does shine. So even the sun shines for the glory of Queen Nefertari.
Sorry, Dr. Brand, this is your 15 minutes alert you requested. Okay,
yes. So we see Nefertari also playing a significant role in the religious life of ancient Egypt. Here she is shown participating with the king in one of the festivals in Thebes. And also we see an image drawing of Queen Nefertari worshiping a goddess directly by herself without the presence of the king. Now, who was Nefertari and where did she come from? There was a small knob found in her tomb that had the name of I, but it seems unlikely that she was related to this disgraced former pharaoh. It's most likely that she is a daughter of one of the courtiers, either a palace or administrative official in Memphis, or perhaps the daughter of some provincial nobility. Because it's very likely that the king, especially when he's marrying all these women, that the Egyptian women that he's marrying, except for these cases of brother-sister marriage, that most of these women must be children of the elite, and that these were kind of political alliances that connected the courtiers and the power structure to the king himself. And again, we see this type of thing going on in other places, such as women that joined the imperial court of the Chinese emperor. Why did Nefertari, instead of these other royal women that are known or unknown, become the great royal wife and the favored position? And I think it almost certainly has to do is that she gave birth to Ramses' first-born surviving son. This would have been Prince Amenhirkhopeshef. And by giving him a viable male heir, this earned her the position of the great royal wife and the supreme queen of Ramses once he came to the throne. And now, so the advantage that Nefertari enjoyed was, exclusive preeminence among all the other royal wives, and that during her lifetime, up until about the 21st or 25th year of his reign, she completely outshines every other royal wife, so that we don't even know their names. And even in the case of the second major wife, we'll see, she only appears after Nefertari's death in terms of monumental prestige. Nefertari was even given a brief diplomatic role where she had the privilege to write a letter to the Hittite queen Pudukheba sending diplomatic gifts. And one of them was a gold necklace that in today's, I just priced it on the gold market, that this gold necklace, this is not the one, it's another gold necklace. But this particular gold necklace that she sent to the Hittites would have been worth $112,000 in today's price, just based on the cost of the gold alone. And she ultimately also was favored by becoming a goddess, as she is deified within her temple at Abu Simbel, next to the great temple of her husband. The second most important queen was the king's secondary wife, Isetnofret, but she is actually the mother of the second-born son, Ramses Jr., as I like to call him, and several of the other significant royal children of Ramses II. But she is overshadowed by Nefertari during Nefertari's lifetime. And it's actually after Nefertari's death and Isetnofret's son, Kamwasa, becomes influential as the high priest of Memphis, that he creates monuments to his family, including to his mother, most likely after even his mother herself had died, because we have no actual kingly monuments that are certain to name Isetnofret. Instead, they come from these private monuments that are dedicated by her children. And ultimately, she had a kind of genetic revenge, because after Nefertari's son Amenhirkhopeshef died, there were a few more crown princes, and one of them, Merneptah, who eventually became pharaoh after Ramses, and all of them were sons of Isetnofret. We also know that Ramses married at least 5 of his daughters. We know that all of them, except for the possible case of Hanutni-Re, that certainly the other 4 were actually daughters of the 2 senior queens, the daughters of Nefertari and Isetnofret. And they were taken in the middle part of the king's reign after the first of his great royal wives had died, and now became substitute consorts for the king. The most significant was Queen Bintanath, the royal daughter, and Queen Bintanath, who seems to have been the sort of the princess royal, the eldest or most favored of all of Ramses' children, born to Queen Isetnofret. And in her tomb, in the Valley of the Queens, tomb 71, there are images that show Bintanath as queen alongside an anonymous princess. This is sometimes taken as being evidence that this princess is the, if you will, daughter sister of Bintanath, but there's no direct real evidence. She's anonymous, and it's much more likely, as recent scholarship has suggested, that this simply represents Bintanath both in her aspect of queen and then also her aspect of royal daughter. Another major royal wife, daughter wife, was Princess Married Amen, who became Queen Married Amen. And then we see that the most privileged members of the royal female household are buried in a special cemetery in the Valley of the Queens, alongside the famous tomb of Queen Nefertari. Are more damaged and less well-preserved tombs, including the tomb of the king's mother and of these 5 senior daughter wives. I suspect that many of Ramses' other daughters were actually put in the giant tomb KB5, which we usually think is the tomb of the royal sons of Ramses, but in fact is described in ancient texts as the tomb of the Messu Nesu, of the children of the king. And I suspect that some of those children were female and not just male children. The tombs of these royal women show them alone, not in the presence of their husband, who is not even named. Perhaps the only royal monuments of Ramses II that don't contain his name or image, and they interact directly with the gods of the underworld to achieve their place in the underworld. There were also diplomatic marriages. The best known are the 2 marriages to Hittite princesses, including the first one that Ramses made a very big deal about. And she became known by her Egyptian name as Neferure, the daughter of the great chief of Hatti, as one of her epithets. We actually don't even know what her original Hittite name was. There's just no evidence for it. So she is known by her Egyptian name that she gains when she enters the Ramesside court. Now, if we try to count up how many wives then did Ramses have, and this is sort of an estimated list. If you include the 2 known senior wives, the first Hittite princess, a second Hittite princess who is unnamed in inscriptions, and diplomatic letters that suggest that he also married a Babylonian princess and perhaps some other foreign women. And then the 5 daughter wives, we have at least 11 wives. And if we add on to the several early wives that produce most of the children, that number could increase to anything from 20 to 30 for all we know. And remember that most of these known wives, name wives, are not the ones that produce most of the children, because they married Ramses later in his career, after he had most of his children. So just a final thing to say is that the purpose, I think, of Ramses presenting all these children on his monument and these wives, but also their ideological role in his conception of kingship, is they're kind of like mirrors that reflect his own glory and his own prestige. By having so many wives, by having so many children, they represent the king as the font of fertility and also as a great ruler who has many wives and many children as part of his royal prestige. Now, 2 last little things here. If you're more interested in some of my articles and books, you can check out my Academia EDU page. And if you're interested in my project at Karnak, the Great Hypostyle Hall project, there's a website here connected with the University of Memphis. And I would also love if some of you were interested enough to purchase my book on Ramses that gives a lot more information about the king, including his family. And if anybody has or is going to purchase it, it would really help me out if you could do an online review on Amazon, or at least a rating, because it boosts the number of people that see the book when it appears on Amazon. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brandt, for this, for your wonderful and valuable insights in this presentation. We would have about 15 minutes to answer questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. My first quick burning question is, what are your future research plans on this topic? Professor Brandt, do you intend to expand your scope to include more pharaohs?
Well, yeah, so this was definitely a focus on the royal family of Ramses II, and as the ultimate example, perhaps, of Egyptian ideology. It's also the best known about the royal family because we know so much. In fact, we know more sons of Ramses II than we know of all the princes that are named from the 18th dynasty, although there must have been hundreds of royal princes in the 18th dynasty. Also, they're not as well known in the monuments. But I would like to study the dynamics of how royal polygamy worked, look at this question of what the so-called harem is not a harem, but something else, and think about the ideological conceptions of polygamy, and to do some more comparisons with specific historical cultures, both ancient and modern, where similar systems of royal polygamy happened. And you can see parallels between the dynamics of the political and social dynamics and the ideological factors in these polygamous royal systems, all the way from antiquity down to the Ottoman sultans or the shogun and emperor of Japan.
Thank you. I will read some of the questions from the Q&A box for you, Dr. Brand. Was harem house where the women would retire? Any tombs or papyri specific to their life after the king's death?
Well, the question is what happened to these royal women after these kings' deaths, except for the mother of the new king, if she's still alive, that they would have lesser prestige, and they may have even lost their title. And we know this for Ramesses' sister, because she is known from a tomb that was built during her brother's reign, that she is simply called the king's sister, but she was, of course, a daughter of Sety I, and she was no longer called king's daughter. And I suspect that many of these other queens, that after their husbands died, they sort of faded in the background, and sometimes may have even lost the official title of great wife or royal wife, unless they were the king's mother.
Okay. Another question asked, rather than prestige, wouldn't a stronger argument for having many children, particularly sons, be that, as in Saudi Arabia today, they would provide a loyal core of ministers, administrators, generals, and ambassadors?
Well, that's actually a very good question. I'm glad you raised this, because one of the things we see about the role of royal princes over the course of Egyptian history is that in the early Old Kingdom, in fact, royal brothers and sons participated in the administration, could even become viziers and other high. But the question is, if you have a member of the royal family who has real political power or control of major levers of the state, can you trust them? And in fact, beginning in the 5th dynasty, and probably continuing throughout Egyptian history, is that these princes were limited to more ceremonial positions, but they were not given power. None of Ramses' sons ever became a vizier. None of them ever became the ministry of the treasure. None of them, even when they received military titles like general of the army, it may have even been more of a ceremonial post, just like, princes today join, the sons of Elizabeth II, they joined the British military and did their time. But some of these royal sons became quote unquote generals while they were still children. So obviously they weren't leading troops. So I think it's much more likely that these royal sons sort of, lay about the palace or had minor control over certain royal estates, but did not actually have access to the highest levels of power.
Okay, another question. Were there issues of paternity? What was the role of eunuchs over time in the court generally and in the women's quarter?
Well, this is one of the question of eunuchs is another one of these things that, like the question of concubines, which of course do occur in other cultures, including some later ancient cultures, that unless it was in the very late periods of Egyptian history when they were borrowing from practices and were ruled by kings of other civilizations, in the New Kingdom, as far as we can tell, and probably earlier, there are no such thing as a eunuch, and there certainly is no such thing as a quote-unquote concubine. There were male palace staff, and we even know from some of them that these palace staffs, even the director of the royal household, were actually men that were married and had children of their own, so they were definitely not eunuchs.
Mm-hmm. And how do we know the royal women were not cloistered?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons because some of them are traveling with the king, but there's no indication that they are confined there. This is another sort of incorrect interpretation of the traditional understanding of the Ottoman harem, where it was believed to be a gilded cage. And even new studies show that although royal women had privacy and nobody could come into their private quarters, that doesn't mean that they were locked up there. One of the early interpretations of Per Henner is that it was the confined household. In other words, sort of, again, a household prison. But again, this has been rejected now that we understand that the term Henner actually means these female musical performers. And so there's no reason to believe. Again, it doesn't mean they were always running out all the time, but they had opportunities to leave, at least some of them. And there's nothing explicit in the design of the palaces or their location within major capitals that they were impenetrable in the sense that or unescapable, if you will, that royal women couldn't go out. And we often see ceremonial scenes where various royal women, not just the great royal wife, are shown in public ceremonies. And they would have participated in court life as well. And so they weren't locked in their quarters. They probably at least had the run of the palace and other opportunities to go outside their domicile, for various purposes, including religious festivals.
Was it typical for pharaohs to marry their daughters? Were there religious reasons that promoted that?
It's one of those imponderable questions. Of course, we're familiar in the 18th dynasty with kings tending to marry their sisters or half-sisters, including the fact that Tutankhamun married his sister Ankhesenamun. That might have been for a purpose of narrowing the blood pool of eligible successors. If you say, well, the king has many children, if you got 50 sons and they all want to become king, you're going to have a fight on your hands. Quite literally, even civil war. But if you say only the sons that are born to the most high-ranking queen or queens are actually eligible to succeed, and sorry to the rest of you lads, you have to go away because there's no possibility that you can succeed dad. And one of the ways this might have been done in the 18th dynasty is by maybe some unwritten rule that you can't become the next king unless your mother is the king's sister wife. Of course, that has genetic complications from inbreeding, and that's perhaps why the 18th dynasty died out with Tutankhamun and his two stillborn children found in his tomb.
There is one opinion that says that he gave the title of royal wife to honor his daughter after the death of her mother. Is there evidence that he actually married her?
Well, again, they held the title of royal wife, and there are 5 of them. As I say, the only possible evidence that we saw from Bentona's tomb that they could have produced children by their father is very weak, and they may have been even ceremonial marriages, but that they probably took the place of their mothers. In this case, Isetnofret and Nefertari, as their mothers aged or after their mothers died, especially since all the royal daughter wives are their mothers are these 2 women. And now Bentonath even survives her father and lives under the reign of her brother Merneptah, where she is also given the title of king's wife on a statue of Merneptah. And so she may have ceremonially married her younger brother, but being in their 70s or late 60s, it's unlikely that they had children.
Thank you. A question from Jeff Lemia. Hi, Jeff. Was polygamy also characteristic in the general public?
That is another thing that it's not quite clear. As far as I know, most of the time, if not all the time, it didn't happen. This may have been exclusively royal privilege. On the other hand, we do know that there were what we would call consanguineous, or what you would call incestuous marriages between non-royal individuals. There's a new book on the subject. But in terms of having multiple wives at the same time, this is not clear. And we do have documentation that shows that various men and women had marriage partners who were divorced or who died, and then there was a new marriage.
Thank you. Can any children be traced specifically to the Hittite wife or wives?
Well, all we know is one of the later diplomatic letters talks about, and I talk about it in the chapter on the marriage alliance, that apparently, according only from cuneiform sources, so one of these diplomatic letters that Ramesses sent, is that this Hittite princess produced a daughter, much to the annoyance of her grandfather, the Hittite king, who even sort of gave Ramesses a kind of implied insult by saying, "Is it true that that you have so many sons, as I've heard? Then why couldn't you give a son to my daughter?" But we don't know who that daughter is. There's no indication of her name on any monument saying this is a daughter of, the Hittite princess that married her father.
Thank you.
But there also could be other children that are not named on the monuments that are even more children we don't know about. Again, we don't know about them, so it's an argument from silence, but it certainly is quite possible. And there was only so much room on the temple walls to show all the children, that there may have been other children that we know nothing about, as well as other wives.
Okay. Someone is saying that they can't buy your book as ebook or PDF on Amazon Canada.
Yes. And I don't know if it's on Amazon USA, but let me just show you the link here.
Okay.
There's this company called ISD Distribution, which is the official distributor for my book from Lockwood Press. And if you go on their website, you can purchase the ebook or PDF for immediate download. And it works. You can charge it, or put it on your card and buy it, and then you get a link to immediately download the book as a PDF or ebook. It's also a bit less expensive than the soft cover.
Okay, but they say they went to Lockwood Press site, but the promo code is not valid.
Yeah, that again has to do probably with Lockwood Press itself, but I would try the IS distribution and see if that works.
Okay.
Because that's where I've seen it sold.
And someone requesting to show the website listed before for Karnak?
Yes, let me just go back. Oh yeah, oops. Yes, this is the Amenhirkhopeshef project, my main project recording inscriptions. So it needs to be updated, but we have an extensive collection of images of all the scenes from the walls of it, and we have various articles sort of interpreting what the function and the history of this building is, and we hope to expand it continuously in the future as we do new documentation, etc. But here you can learn some basic information and also see many images from the temple walls of the hypostyle hall.
Great, thank you. And last question from Chris Henry. Hi, Chris. Were the royal female households kept under guard?
Almost certainly. And we do actually have in the Turin papyrus that describes the assassination conspiracy against Ramesses, is that some of the officials that including guards were involved in the conspiracy, but their job there was not so much to keep the royal women in, but to keep outsiders out of the private quarters of the king's family. So they weren't confined, but they could move out, but you couldn't just walk into the royal apartments.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much again, Professor Brandt, for this wonderful presentation. I want to remind our members that the call for papers has been open for RC's annual meeting in San Francisco, April 25th to the 27th, 2025. And we look forward to seeing many of you then. You can find more information about our programs and events and how to support RC by visiting our website or click on the link in the chat box to make a gift today. Thank you again, Professor Brand, and all of you for sharing part of your weekend with us.
Thank you.